Shalom, Erev Tov here in Jerusalem, good morning in California, and good afternoon elsewhere. I have to apologize. It was planned to be noon, but since we are only changing the clock in Israel tonight, there was something of a confusion. And the message went out that this webinar will be held on at 1 o'clock. So I'm glad that in spite of the change in time, you were able to be with us. This webinar is addressing an issue that clearly is of interest to many of you. And I think many others will be watching the recording. So we had the elections and the counting may have already finished a little while ago. The results are almost all in, and it doesn't seem like the remaining votes will make much of a difference in terms of the larger picture. We had two pre-election webinars, and we had a number of representatives of the competing parties. I think they were excellent, and among them was Rabbi Gilad Kariv, who spoke for the Labour Party. And this is a great opportunity, even though he's not on the webinar with us, to say to those who know him, and I know that many on this call know Rabbi Gilad Kariv, to say how happy we are to have this first, namely the first time that a Reform rabbi serves on the Knesset. It's not the first time that an active Reform Jew serves in the Knesset. We had Nissim Eliad, who was a Knesset member for the Independent Liberal Party, who was the chair of the Reform movement in Israel. And he served in the Knesset for quite a number of years. But clearly, times have changed, and Rabbi Gilad Kariv will make a wonderful addition to the ideological and theological mix, and an important voice for religious pluralism in the Knesset. As always, our webinars are co-sponsored with, in addition to Chidush, Ruach Chidush, Rabbis and Cantors for Religious Freedom and Equality, and we have a number of our board members, executive committee members on this call. J-Plan, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network, and I've not seen the list of participants, but I don't know if Judge Buxbaum, Mark Enshin from Canada, or David Light from New Jersey are on the call, and the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. So it's wonderful to have these partners, and this evening we'll be discussing the results of the elections. They're almost all in, and what they mean. What is this going to do in terms of the area of religion, state, equality, pluralism, and how will it impact diaspora Jewry? There are other opportunities that I'm sure you will have, to look at how the elections may impact on the peace prospects, on the settlements, on security, on the relationship with the US, not with the Jewish community necessarily, etc. I'm no expert on that, and this is a topic that will be widely discussed. Maybe we'll allude to it a little bit, and especially if people will ask questions. So the chat is intended for people to ask questions, make comments. We'll see to what extent I'll be able to read the chat as we go along, but I definitely plan to leave time for comments and further questions because I am interested in your take. And as you will see, there is just, a number of examples of issues that are of as much concern to North American Jewry, to world Jewry, as they are to me living here in Israel. So without further ado, let me take you to the, one second, okay. All right. Hopefully you are seeing the screen and the PowerPoint presentation. Stanley, can you nod your head if you actually see the, you do, very good, all right. So first of all, let's look at the election results. You may have already seen it in the media that, the media of your choice. These are almost the final results. They represent practically all the polls that people voted in, except for what we call double envelopes. And this time around, there were about 450,000 voters who voted in double envelopes, mostly, for instance, soldiers, Israelis who serve overseas in the foreign corps or security services, the Jewish agency, emissaries, etc., who are allowed to vote from overseas. Israelis in general cannot have an absentee ballot. And this time around, people who were quarantined, people who were hospitalized, etc., special provisions were made to enable them to vote. So the 450,000 double envelopes are counted separately, and their results are not in. It is expected that they will not make that much of a difference. They may shift one mandate in either direction, but unlikely that they will change the balance of power between the two competing blocs. So the Likud has managed to emerge as not only the largest party, but significantly larger than any of its opponents, any of its competitors. But that which was celebrated by the Likud when the initial results were known is just not enough, because as you know, we have 120 Knesset members, and in order to form a governing coalition, and I'm saying a governing coalition because throughout the history of the state, no one party was able to get the majority of the votes, and therefore from 1948 onwards, there was need to create a coalition. So 30 is just quite far from the minimum of 61 which are required in order to form a governing coalition. So let's just take a look at this list. So the leading opposition party is Yesh Atid, the party that's led by Yair Lapid. Yair Lapid had a very interesting strategy, probably advised by Mark Mellman. Most of the parties, or most of the leading parties in Israel, had American consultants on strategy, on polling, etc. Mark Mellman has been Yesh Atid's consultant for quite a number of years. And his interesting strategy was keep quiet. So when all the leaders of the competing parties were fighting to be interviewed in the media, Yair Lapid stayed outside the studios. He issued releases, he made written statements, but he would not be interviewed, thinking, and it did actually work, thinking that keeping quiet was a desirable approach at this time, rather than be questioned by unfriendly or picky journalists that may trip him. Shas, the ultra-Orthodox Sephardic party, has been able to get their support, and as you can see, they fare relatively high. Of course, nothing like their heyday, because Shas was able years ago to get 15 or maybe even 16 mandates, but 15 for sure. So they've come down from their days of glory, in part probably having to do with the fact that the leader, Rabbi Aryeh Deri, served time in prison for bribe-taking and other serious financial offenses. But there may have been other reasons. This is an interesting anomaly. Shas is an ultra-Orthodox party, ultra-Orthodox Sephardic party, which is led by a rabbinic council. Of course, the grand rabbi that is, even though he has passed away already a number of years ago, his face and his impact is still their winning card in wide circles. And they are using him in almost every campaign item, campaign poster, campaign video. He's still their ace in the box. But they, even though they are an ultra-Orthodox party, they get much of their support based on raising ethnic. Well, you can look at it from both sides of the coin, ethnic frustrations and raising the ethnic frustrations and then presenting themselves as the party that will be addressing those frustrations. Or you can look at it positively, namely they provide for the equivalent of Black Pride, so this is Sephardic Pride. In any case, Shas, the ultra-Orthodox Sephardic party, is the third largest party in the Knesset. Blue and white, Benny Gantz's party. If you remember, in the previous elections, they were able to get 36 mandates, and then they split and resplit and split for the third time, to the point that Gantz, who entered Netanyahu's cabinet on a parity basis with 15, was basically left with 15 Knesset members out of the original 36 or so, remained with practically 4 or 5, and many observers, analysts, pollsters, etc., anticipated that they may disappear altogether because of the disappointment they caused so many in terms of promising, read my lips, promising. The one thing they will not do is join Bibi in his coalition, and the one thing that they did do, based on numerous promises that were made to them, was to join Bibi's coalition, and many expected that they would pay the penalty and disappear altogether. That didn't quite happen, and surprisingly, more than anybody anticipated, they received 8 seats in these last elections. There's a whole discussion as to what exactly happened and why are they perceived as possibly one of the leading victors in the elections, because of the gap between the expectations that they would disappear and their significant showing. Yamina, Naftali Bennett's party, well, there are now 2 parties that claim to represent the Zionist Orthodox sector, Yamina and religious Zionism. Yamina is Naftali Bennett's party that has, on the one hand, modern Orthodox, Zionist Orthodox, but has some secular elements that are supporting both the right-wing cause and the traditional cause. And the religious Zionists that received 6 following intensive push by Bibi Netanyahu helping them. And maybe we'll get to explaining how far he went in order to help them get elected for 2 reasons. One, in order to spite Yamina and lower Yamina's base of support. And the other is assuming and relying on the fact that Bezalel Smotrich, the leader of the religious Zionism party, which is, by the way, really a sort of a grab of a concept of religious Zionism and attaching it to a party supposedly representing religious Zionism, but of course not doing so, because at this point religious Zionists do not see themselves represented by any single party. So Bibi supported, Prime Minister Netanyahu supported Smotrich's party, both because he wanted to erode and undermine Yamina and the leaders of Yamina, namely Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked, and because he felt that he could rely on the religious Zionism party to support him, whereas Bennett refused to commit to support Netanyahu or announce who is going to support in any case. Actually, Bennett went on a ticket saying, I am going to be the next prime minister. I'm the only one that's really fit for that replacement of Netanyahu, etc. United Torah Judaism, the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party, they have more or less a fixed base of ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi. There are very few outside the mold, outside the circle of Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox that vote for them. By the way, there are ultra-Orthodox Sephardic yeshiva students who vote for them, because historically it was Rabbi Shach, the leader of Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodoxy, that gave rise and supported the establishment of Shas in the first place. Israel Beiteinu, Avigdor Lieberman, that ran from the second round in the 4-round elections. The March 2021 elections is the 4th in 2 years. So from the second round onwards, Israel Beiteinu, which in the first round had 5 seats, pushed a single key agenda item, and that was religious freedom, or doing away with religious coercion. And it has certainly helped them keep and increase their support somewhat. Labor is, in the eyes of many, sort of, a revival, a magic revival of a party about whom many were ready to say Kaddish and expected that it would disappear. It has gone down considerably over the years, from its glory days as the leading party in Israel to almost extinction. It was the new leader of labor, Merav Michaeli, a very outspoken, visible, relatively new political leader, who brought it new enthusiasm and new image. And of course, new image, new enthusiasm, and we come to new hope. Well, new hope really presented a great new hope initially, because Gideon Sa'ar, a senior Likud leader for decades, created new hope. And initially the polls anticipated that they would get as high as 20 or maybe even more seats. It has gone downhill from there. And in the elections, they ultimately got 6 seats. The joint list, there too, there was a tragedy, internally seen as a tragedy, and externally, I think Netanyahu quite enjoyed what transpired. the joint list was created initially is a response to the raising of the threshold to 3.25%, and the four Arab political parties that joined together to create a joint list felt that this was the best assurance to pass the threshold. They received 15 seats in the previous Knesset, and then just before these elections, they split, and three of the parties remained in New Hope, whereas Mansour Abbas split from the joint list and led Ra'am separately, and they, after some time since the elections, when it was the exit polls, etc., anticipated that they would not pass the threshold, but they did, and they show 4 seats. Maybe they'll even get 5 seats. And lastly, Meretz. Meretz remained as the sort of left pallbearer, left-wing pallbearer, both Jewish and a number of Arab members. Many may remember Shulamit Aloni leading Meretz party. Yossi Beilin for a while led Meretz party, and now it is led by Nitzan Horowitz. They too were projected by some of the polls as due to disappear, and they ran what we call in Israel a Gewalt campaign, namely constant phone calls and posters and other media campaign items. We are going to disappear if you don't support us, and it'll be a terrible thing if we disappear. It'll be a sure a sign for Netanyahu being able to get his majority of 61 plus. You need to come to our help. Even if you considered voting from some other party, come and vote for Meretz. It worked, and they got 6. All right. So let's just briefly look at what happens now. Now, I have the pie chart of all 4 parties, and as you can see, the general picture has not really changed much. The first, April 2019, what you can see is Bibi received among the Likud MKs and those who vowed to support the Likud, 60. The anti-Bibi, 55. And Yisrael Beitenu had the swing vote of 5 seats in April of 2019. As I told you, following the April elections, Avigdor Lieberman realized that a winning card would be the religious freedom ticket. And this is what he has been pushing ever since, and it paid off. So from 5, he got to 8 in September. And again, you can see Bibi's dilemma. Pro-Bibi, 55, Avigdor Lieberman, that could have given him, the government could have given him the majority already in April, decided that he will not cast his lot with Bibi Netanyahu for a variety of reasons. We don't need to get into it, but he kept out. And he had the swing vote. The anti-Bibi amounted to 57 seats. And it was impossible to form a stable government. Now, I'm saying pro-Bibi and anti-Bibi. One important thing to bear in mind is that it's been long since the battle in Israel was between left and right. For quite a number of years now, and especially in the 4 election rounds in the last 2 years, it's been pro-Bibi and anti-Bibi, because the anti-Bibi is not left anymore. The anti-Bibi is consisting of an interesting mix that have very little to glue them together, from the Arab joint list to the right-wing parties, that especially in the current elections, whether it's Lieberman or Gidon Saar, or for that matter, you'll see Yamina, no one can honestly and with integrity call them left. So this is the September 19, and as you can see, the two blocks are so close to each other. And then the March 2020, again, the same story, comparable numbers. Israel Beitenu still has the swing vote, 58, with Avigdor Lieberman. Bibi would have had 65, but Lieberman would not give him his support. Now the picture has slightly changed, though the principle remained. Still, the two blocks are in a deadlock, but the swing vote is no longer with Avigdor Lieberman, but rather different faces. Yamina, 7 seats, led by Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked, and oddly, surprisingly, Ra'am led by Mansour Abbas. Ra'am, led by Mansour Abbas, is a Muslim, an Islamist party, religiously and socially very conservative. One of the things that pulled them out of the joint list was their strong opposition to granting equality or acknowledging rights of LGBTQ. This was something that they blew out fire over and caused internal strife within the joint list, and one of the contributing factors to their decision to run independently. But the other reason was they presented or are presenting a realistic approach to the political friction, the political battles in Israel. Namely, their leader Mansour Abbas is saying, surely I have a religious Islamic convictions. Surely I am not a Zionist, not in anywhere close to it. As a matter of fact, there were a number of photographs and a number of speeches that he carried out that showed problematic attitude toward shaheeds who carried out terrorist attacks and died, and other pronouncements that placed him within the camp that the right wing, the nationalist camp in Israel would view as anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish state, and therefore to keep away from. But he has introduced before and since his defecting from the joint list a realistic approach that says what we need to focus on is helping the Arab sector gain its rights, gain support, which it is denied because of the ages-old friction by Arab politicians that refuse to play the game. So some are suggesting, and the reports are that Bibi Netanyahu's emissaries have already reached out to Mansour Abbas, the leader of Ra'am, trying to gain his support as well. Now, if Mansour Abbas were to support Netanyahu, and we are not dealing necessarily with support as forming part of the coalition, but possibly outside support, quietly voting for them from the outside. 52 and 4 just won't make enough. And therefore, Netanyahu needs, and 52 and 7 will make 59. The reports from Israel will tell you that the Bibi bloc has 59. It doesn't really have 59 because it's not clear that Yamina will support Bibi Netanyahu. There is a lot of bad blood between Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked on the one hand and Bibi Netanyahu on the other. As a matter of fact, it was Bibi who fired them, who threw them out of his coalition government. And it's a whole story. Some of it is is rumors and all kinds of other, in unpleasant stories about the role that Sarah Netanyahu plays in this growing friction between them, etc. Netanyahu needs both Yamina and Ra'am in order to be able to have, well, if they both supported him actively or quietly, he would have 63. And 63 already is a majority. But we need to bear in mind 61, 62, 63, to a degree, it's a mathematical majority, but it's suicidal. Because this is, as one of the leading commentators in the Israeli media, Amnon Abramovich from Channel 12 News, said, when your coalition consists of 61 members out of the 120, the most important member of that coalition is not the number 1 member, it's the number 61 member. Because 61, the 61st member of the 61 strong coalition can pull the rug from under you and cause the coalition to collapse. Everyone in a coalition of that sort can extort the whole group. So you can see that this is a political nightmare, whichever way you look at it. And the other thing that you see, or that you do not see, but I'm sharing with you, is this already caused some strife within the Likud, and certainly with the religious Zionists led by Bezalel Smotrich. Today, Bezalel Smotrich said, I'm not going to be a member of any coalition that has Ra'am and Mansour Abbas supporting it openly, supporting it indirectly, supporting it as a member of the coalition, supporting it from the outside the coalition. Doesn't make any difference, he announced publicly. I'm not going to be part of such a coalition. So that also came out from within the Likud. And some of that strife, internal strife, was reported in the media to the point that today the media could no longer get anybody from the Likud to be interviewed because there was a gag order issued in order to avoid airing these differences on the outside. So basically what you can see is that since the first elections, in this 4-election round, namely April 2019, to the current elections, March 2021, the picture is more or less the same, even though some of the players have changed. Blue and white is no longer the leading opposition. Avigdor Lieberman no longer holds the swing vote, but still the two blocks that are identified by, on the one hand, pro-Bibi, on the other hand, anti-Bibi, not by left-right divisions, is still in a deadlock. And therefore, it is no surprise that many in Israel are now talking about the inevitability of there being a 5th election round. Everybody vows not to have that happen. But there is really no clear roadmap as to how that would be avoided. Netanyahu, of course, has a suggestion. He says, if everybody on the right will come into my coalition, we will not have a 5th elections. But of course, there are so many on the other side, even though they're on the right, who have been burned by Netanyahu and have vowed not to enter any political collaborative effort with him, that his statements, his appeals in the last couple of days since the elections are sounding more like begging, more like expressions of despair than anything else. So let's talk a little bit more about religion and state, and then I'll stop and we'll see where you want us to go. So one thing is very clear, namely the makeup of Netanyahu's coalition was destined to be from the beginning. He hoped that he would get more members in his bloc, and he tried all kinds of tricks. If the previous elections were characterized by ugly, violent speech, hate speech, these elections, he was almost like, an endearing elder statesman. There was hardly any negativism that came out of him, but rather self-glory, much of it, of course, well-earned. But this was a very different campaign and a very different Netanyahu than in the elections that took place the last time or the time before. But still, his initial bloc, or what is called in Israel Hashutafim HaTiviyim, the natural allies, is very clearly identified. It consists of course, the Likud, the ultra-Orthodox two parties, namely Shas and United Torah Judaism, and the Chardalim, and this time it used to be Yamina at one point, and this time it's the religious Zionists. Except they are not enough, but they are at the core. And one of the questions that was asked in a recent poll, now those of you who know the Chidush polls will remember, we've been asking this question every year in the last few years. We have been asking these questions before some of the recent elections, after the elections. We asked it in different times, namely, would you like to see the ultra-Orthodox parties in the coalition or out? Or if you wanted to see the ultra-Orthodox parties in the coalition, would you have them maintain their role in being a deciding factor on matters of Judaism, or would you like them to be relieved of that, decisive role? This is a survey that was done by another polling company, Midgam, for Channel 12 News on January 26, and the answer is very clear. 61% want to see the next coalition without the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox political parties. So this is consistent. This is consistent in every poll that's done by everybody on this question. And as I'm saying, Chidush has numerous polls in which the same answer is given, though with slightly different percentage point attached to it, but overall clear majority. Now, when you look at the division, and Channel 12 TV asked for the division and distinguish between those who define themselves as political right and those that define themselves as political center and left. Obviously, the animosity, the rejection is much greater in the center left. 78% of those who were going to vote for, and again, I'm reminding you, this is January 26, shortly or leading to the elections. So 78% who intended to vote for center and left of center parties said, keep the ultra-Orthodox parties out of the government, out of the coalition. Only 5% said they are an integral part of Israel's government, we don't want them out. But the interesting thing is that even those who define themselves as right-wing politically, still a majority of 52% are saying, keep them out. Only 33% of the natural allies, those who define themselves as right, want to see the ultra-Orthodox as part of the government. So please understand what these figures mean, and it's important to again bear in mind that this isn't a single survey. This is the same consistent response of the public to every question that's asked about this, namely the overwhelming majority, say to Netanyahu, say to themselves, say to the country, say to the nation, we don't want a government that relies on and is dependent on the ultra-Orthodox parties. So the move to entrench a coalition that has them in the center and basically having the control, the keys to the treasury through Rabbi Moshe Gafni, the head of the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party, United Torah Judaism, or the Minister of the Interior, who, and I don't know if you have read recently our reports, we have now gone to court representing 8 couples, and there are more couples that have turned to us since then, and Chidush, and the 2 Reform rabbis in Salt Lake City and Park City, Utah, over the illegal intervention of Rabbi Deri, which is just a token example of the way that he abuses the authority that was vested in him, ordering the population registry to refrain from registering the legal marriage certificates that are obtained from Utah County, perfectly legal, publicly known and recognized throughout the US and beyond the US, but being especially important during the pandemic period, being able for couples from Israel and elsewhere in the world and elsewhere in the US to obtain the marriage certificate and have the actual wedding officiated online without having to be present in Utah other than the officiant. The officiant has to be present in Utah. So here is Rabbi Aryeh Deri, the leader of Shas and the leader of heading the Ministry of the Interior, abusing his authority and ordering the population registry that have taken 2 months since the application for registration was submitted by couples. And the first 2, after 2 months, were registered when the population registry satisfied itself that these were legal weddings on the up and up, meeting the requirements of Utah, state of Utah laws. The first 2 couples were registered, and then the order came down to stop, and already now for some 5 months, they're not being registered. And when we Chidush petitioned to the administrative court, and this is just one example, as I said, of what happens when an ultra-Orthodox party gains control over such key services as those provided by the Ministry of the Interior, namely registration of personal status. So the public doesn't want this to continue. And that is a characteristic of not only the people on the left and the center, but even the majority of those on the right. Now, on February 21st, just shortly before the elections, the Israel Democracy Institute ran a special survey trying to see a number of responses of the public to key controversial issues. Some of them are right in our, in our basket. So 3 questions were asked about matters of religion and state. Should there be full equality of status given to Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jewish denominations, Reform and Conservative? And I apologize for my Reconstructionist and Renewal friends. Again, that was not part of the question that I asked, simply because they are still not present enough in Israel, but that will happen too. So should there be full equality of status given to Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jewish denominations, Reform and Conservative, on issues such as conversion, kashrut, and marriage? Well, now, this is percentage out of the entire sample. Mind you, the entire sample is both Jews and non-Jews. And there are about 20% non-Jews, mostly Arabs, So 55% of the entire representative sample of the Israeli society say, yes, there should be full equality. Well, yes, there is support for equality to the non-Orthodox, but as you can see, this is not the most important issue on the minds of the general public. Support, yes, but this is not the top priority. So second question that was asked is opening of trade and entertainment establishments in areas with secular majorities on the Sabbath. Note that this is asking about opening of trade, businesses. It is not asking about public transportation on Shabbat, because when you have public transportation on Shabbat, the percentage is even higher. But because the Israelis, as we have shown in the Chidush studies, Israelis make a distinction. They see public transportation on Shabbat as an essential service that deprives people of mobility when they don't have the luxury of a private car. And therefore, there is much greater level of support. But even with opening of businesses in secular areas where the secular are the majority, 62% support it. And then civil marriage be available to anyone who wants it, 65%. Again, this is of the entire sample. In the Jewish community, support for civil marriage is much greater. The Arab public is much more conservative religiously, and therefore much less inclined to support civil marriages. But let's see how this breaks down, and we'll do that quickly. So question 1, 2, 3. 1 is equality of the streams, 2 is opening of stores on Shabbat, and 3, civil marriages available to everyone. So as you can see, there is someone has his microphone not muted. Just a minute. Okay, so when you look at the different parties, you will see the contrast between Israel Beiteinu, Blue and White, Yesh Atid, Labor, and Meretz that are for the most part, and you can see that it's varying degrees, support equality for the streams, opening of stores on Shabbat, and civil marriages. The joint list, you don't see a question of civil marriages, and I'm not entirely sure whether this is just an oversight or they didn't feel that they could even ask the question without getting clobbered. And it happened to us when, yes.
I'm sorry, it appears that's not the question. The one they skipped was the equality of the streams.
Okay, thank you. If that's the case, then thank you very much. Then that explains it. It was deemed irrelevant. But I can still tell you that when we ran a comprehensive survey of the views of the Arab sector in Israel on issues of marriage freedom, the pollster, an Arab research center, refused to include the question that we included in the questionnaire for the Jewish public regarding same-sex marriages, and said, if I included that question, people will slam the phone and I will lose all my credibility. It's really quite remarkable. So you can see where the sort of center and left of center is, a center, left and center, and with Israel Beiteinu certainly right, but compare it to, just a second. Compare it to the right, and you can see a mirror image, namely the opposite. United Torah Judaism and Shas and religious Zionism are, basically opposing all of these, strongly opposing all of these. And you can see a little bit of a difference between United Torah Judaism and Shas, because I alluded to it, whereas Shas is an ultra-Orthodox party, its constituency to a great degree is traditional. It's not all ultra-Orthodox, or far from it. It's mostly ethnic, Sephardic ethnic vote. So you can see a level of greater openness, a greater support than in the case of the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox. You can see that religious Zionism is basically leaning towards ultra-Orthodoxy, even as they call themselves religious Zionism. On the other hand, Yamina is falling somewhere in the center with views that are far more inclusive, far more pluralistic on those issues, such as 55% supporting civil marriages, 55% supporting opening of stores and entertainment on Shabbat in non-religious neighborhoods. And you can see the Likud also a strong support, 55% regarding Shabbat, and close to 50% that are supporting pluralism and civil marriages. And of course, New Hope politically being on the right, and those of you who have heard Danny Dayan will remember, I mean, he represented that in our webinar on, before leading to the elections. So Danny Dayan represented that brand, which was certainly right-wing politically in terms of security, settlements, etc., but much more liberal on civil issues. And you can see that here. They ask questions about social equality. Should everyone 18 years old and up be doing either military or civil service? 73% supported. Equal rights for same-sex couples, 61% supported. And a very touchy issue that I think many here on the call are sensitive and interested in, namely, should the nation-state law be amended so as to include equality, which it doesn't currently, equality for non-Jewish citizens. 53% of the entire sample, again, Jews and Arabs support it. And if you look at the breakdown, you will see again that the center and left, including Israel Beiteinu, are very strongly supportive of the equality amendment and same-sex couples and a mandatory conscription, either military or civil service, to all. And of course, no surprise, the joint list, only 18% are supporting military or civil service for all, and only 41% supporting equality for same-sex couples. It follows, what we assume regarding the Arab sector. And of course, a very different picture coming from United Torah Judaism, Shas, religious Zionism, and those mixed views of the Likud and Yamina. And lastly, another issue that's not directly connected to religion and state, but is very close to it, namely separation of powers. Should the Knesset have more supervision of government? Strong support for that. Many feel that the government actually pulls the strings of the Knesset to the point that the Knesset lost its supervisory and oversight role. An issue that has become a front and center issue in the elections. Should the Supreme Court be able to repeal laws enacted by the Knesset? Here in our webinars, we have dealt a number of times, and even more so in our written materials, regarding the override clause, that would enable the Knesset with a simple majority to do away with every decision of the Supreme Court which they don't like. Clearly, the public does not support that notion of eroding the authority and blocking the Supreme Court judicial review regarding laws of the Knesset. So the majority wants the Supreme Court to have that power, and another push by the Likud, the Speaker of the Knesset, Yariv Levin, the Minister of Internal Security, Amir Ohana, and of course the ultra-Orthodox parties, etc. They want more political impact on, or more political influence and control of a selection of judicial appointments, over judicial appointments, and especially the Supreme Court. No, the majority of the public does not want to see that. Only 40% are supporting politicians having more power in judicial selection, and the majority doesn't want it. Okay, we won't look at the breakdown. I realize that we have sort of gone very quickly towards the end of the hour. We'll go on for just a little while. Netanyahu faces a challenge. It is not at all clear that he'll be able to meet that challenge. All kinds of creative ideas are raised. One of them is, well, since neither the pro-Bibi nor the anti-Bibi camp is able to form a stable government, how about having an interim period, let's say a year or even less than a year, in which a less controversial figure, and oddly, the less controversial figure now is, for instance, Benny Gantz, who has not really made anybody mad at him in recent months, other than the initial decision to enter into Bibi's coalition. So how about having all the opposition groups that amount to 61? 61, because Bibi has the support of only 59. And this close tie is really making the whole picture so politically unstable. So let's have some say the 61 support removing Yariv Levin from position of Speaker of the Knesset and appointing a Speaker of the Knesset that speaks for the opposition and acts for the opposition. And let's have a temporary interim government that will enjoy the support of 61, possibly even more, but at least 61, headed by Gantz, address only Corona and economic related issues. And once Netanyahu is removed from office as prime minister, will be healing the system gradually and go into new elections that are not dominated by Netanyahu, but are dominated by ideological differences. And then maybe in the fifth round, we'll be able to have a clear decision coming out of the public as to which direction should we be taking. Of course, the alternative is on the Netanyahu side, trying to win over both Yamina and Naftali Bennett. And basically the message is, let bygones be bygones. Not too many people are willing at this point to believe that Netanyahu is capable of following an approach of let bygones be bygones, because the recent history tells a different story. And again, don't misunderstand me. My message is not an anti-Bibi message. I'm just trying to be descriptive as to how those who currently are in the anti-Bibi camp feel about this. So some are saying that Bibi is going to make promises and lure into his coalition some defectors, such as from Blue and White, possibly from other parties, and make them an offer they couldn't refuse. And there is a history to offers that couldn't be refused being made throughout the Israeli political history. So that is another possibility, that somehow move from the 59 to 61, namely, if you are able to find 2 Knesset members who are going to be willing to support the Bibi coalition, then for Bibi that is enough to have a confidence vote and have his rule and his government perpetuated. There are other ideas as to defectors from the Likud, trying to get one of the ultra-Orthodox parties to shift their support. All of these ideas sound sort of illusionary to a degree, but before we started the webinar, we said, things that don't look like they are doable are possible. Israel is a land of miracles, and the political miracles too may happen. The one thing that I wanted to stress in this webinar is the following. If people felt in recent years that somehow issues of religion and state lost their power, their impact on Israeli society, that somehow Israelis didn't really care about those issues, the figures, the campaigns, the fact that this is now not just Avigdor Lieberman, but you found these voices coming from a number of directions throughout the political opposition spectrum, should tell you that the conflict of religion and state is and has been, but is today, a key element in the political game, in the political struggle. And in this political struggle, it's particularly important for diaspora Jewish leadership to understand. The overwhelming majority of Israelis support the notion of religious freedom and equality. Even if a majority of 61 or 63 is formed around the demands of the ultra-Orthodox parties to perpetuate the monopoly of the chief rabbinate, the exclusion of civil marriages, the prohibition on public transportation on Shabbat, the rejection of equal rights to LGBTQ, etc. That's not where the Israeli public is. And the self-serving claims that you hear just today from the leader of Shas and leaders in the Likud, the public has shown once again it is a traditional public. It's a traditional people. They want a Jewish government. They want a Jewish state. Yes, Israelis want a Jewish state. They want a pluralistic, democratic, and inclusive Jewish state. They don't want a theocratic Jewish state. So it's very important for you to understand that in taking a stand on those issues, you are identifying with the overwhelming majority of Israelis. You're rejecting the political cynicism that is so characteristic of decision-making in the government for decades. And this is not just Netanyahu's government. It should be acknowledged. This has been the case with Labour governments. This has been the case with center governments. And yes, it is the case with right-wing governments. Governments that were willing to sell out to the ultra-Orthodox or the Orthodox parties in order to gain control over the government are governments that betrayed the will of the public and betrayed the core principles of Israel as expressed in Israel's Declaration of Independence. And this is going to be translated, if it happens again, is going to be translated as a policy which rejects the legitimacy of Jewish communities throughout the world that are pluralistic at the core, that respect religious freedom and respect diversity. And the question, therefore, is, what will you do about it? And possibly at this point, when the division is so clear, in addition to supporting a government, and this isn't taking a stand between right and left, but supporting a government, whichever government the Israelis want. And Israelis want a wide civil coalition. Whatever government the Israelis want should be respectful of those core principles. And it's time to go beyond the bashfulness, beyond the timidity, beyond the reluctance to enter into this battleground, because this is the battleground where the future of Israel and the Jewish people is going to be decided. So it was important to me to share with you some of the questions that are bound to come up in the next few days, because any government coalition that's going to be dependent on the support of the ultra-Orthodox parties, we already know it. They have already announced they will not enter into any coalition that will not, A, ensure that who is a Jew is decided only by the chief rabbinate according to Orthodox halacha. 2, ensure that yeshiva students, and we are talking about tens of thousands, yeshiva students are exempt from either doing military service or civil service. And most importantly and most dangerously, ensure that an overriding clause be passed so as to block, to silence, to stop the Supreme Court from doing its job. These 3 elements have again been repeated today as preconditions of the ultra-Orthodox parties to enter into any coalition. No wonder that the majority of Israelis say, save us from this kind of a coalition. All right, we will maybe spend a few more minutes. I see that many needed to leave, have planned other things. Let me see. You know what? If anyone who is still here with us, click on the ask a question, raise your hand.
You're finished.
Okay, my wife tells me that she has just listened and there is the final numbers. And are they any different? No, I think that they are basically the same. So the final numbers seem to be the same. The anti-Bibi bloc, including Ra'am, if Ra'am does not lend its support to Netanyahu, is 61, and the Netanyahu bloc without Ra'am is 59. All right, so raise your hand, use the reactions, and I'll call on you, and unmute yourself and go ahead with any question that you had, rather than me taking the time to read the questions right now. Anybody? I don't, oh yes, Alan, go ahead.
It's not necessarily that important, but I'm curious, during the election campaigning, the issue of how well the Bibi handled the pandemic, the lockdowns, and so it became a political controversy like it has had here, rather than just a health crisis. Do you think the election affected, did he lose votes or win votes because of how he handled the pandemic in the last year?
That's a very interesting question. One thing is very clear. He played the card of vaccinations. He played it to the utmost, basically attributing getting Israel and Israelis the vaccinations as his own achievement, which to some degree it was. Right. But coming from him, it was only his doing, his achievement, and downplaying the over 6,000 that have died, the hundreds of thousands that lost their jobs, the lockdowns, etc. So all in all, it played in his favor rather than against him. And one of the observers that wrote about it pointed out to something very interesting. I don't know what the English terminology is, but Netanyahu was driven in his campaign, like he wasn't 71, he was a youth. He moved all over the country. He spoke from his car, he spoke on Facebook, he spoke on Twitter, he spoke on TikTok. He did variety of things. That kept him moving and kept him speaking and kept him making impact all day long. He in the Hebrew is who met. I mean, he was willing to die in the commission of this dynamic campaign. What this observer pointed out is that basically no one else from the opposition came even close to him in terms of the intensity of the campaign, in terms of responding in kind, namely when Netanyahu spoke about the vaccinations, none of them really drastically, emotionally spoke about the dead, spoke about the unemployed, spoke about the destruction of the economy, spoke about the preferential treatment to the ultra-Orthodox. All of that was done with a level of gentleness, level of serenity almost. And therefore this observer said, that's just not the way to fight politically, to fight Bibi. And basically, if the opposition didn't do better, they have themselves to question. Peter Buxbaum, Judge Peter Buxbaum, co-chair of JPLAN, the Jewish Pluralism Legal Action Network. But 1 second, Peter, my wife actually handed me a correction. So there was one shift in the final results of the vote. Yesh Atid is not 17 mandates. In the final counting, it rose to 18. And this one one seat was taken from Yisrael Beitenu, which is down from 7 to 6. So Yisrael Beitenu 6 and Yesh Atid 18. And by the way, I'll gladly, we will send out the PowerPoint presentation along with the follow-up and the link to the recording. Peter Buxbaum, go ahead.
Just following up on what you said, is there anyone other than Bibi that will step up and become a vocal leader? Is there someone with a big mouth like Donald Trump to speak for the center left?
Well, no one has emerged as yet. They basically all took the same position, namely the main contenders. Each of them in turn said, I am the chosen one. I'm the right one, and none of the others fits the bill. Not a good way to have, to have a collaborative and coordinated opposition campaign. They couldn't unite before the elections, and as yet it doesn't look like there is a willingness to identify one of them as the potent, counter leader. But at this point, I think what emerges is that this isn't just about there being an parallel to Netanyahu in leadership, but rather the animosity, the frustration that so many of the political players and Israelis feel that is preventing Netanyahu, in spite of everything that he is doing and everything that he's saying, and all the vaccinations that he got, to get out of this deadlock, which you have seen occur in 4 elections. So 4 times he has declared victory, but as others point out, this is actually the 4th time that he is unable to get a majority and form a government. All right, anybody else? If not, stay tuned, more to come. More to come, of course, in terms of news from Israel, but more to come from Chidush as well, when the negotiations are going to be launched, when the actual proposals are going to be on the table, when the concessions that will need to be made are going to be made. They are fascinating, not only in terms of religion and state, but in terms of the attitude toward Israeli Arabs and toward the Israeli Arab politicians, who certainly are not part of the Zionist movement, and therefore making and aligning with them is creating a havoc within the right, and is certainly not something that even political convenience can necessarily justify in the eyes of ideologically committed right-wing Israelis. So, Chag Sameach, let's remember Pesach is the festival of Cheirut, of liberty. And liberty is not just independence, liberty is really about freedom. It's about religious freedom, it's about a sense of equality. And as we celebrate Pesach, let's remember that as a people, we strive not just for our own liberty, for the liberty for all. We understand the importance of liberty, of freedom of choice, of not being in bondage. And that bondage can be variety of manifestations of bondage. So let's celebrate Pesach. Let's recommit to a people that seeks freedom, that seeks choice, that seeks justice, and may the days following Pesach, as the political news unfold in Israel, bring good news and bring hope and progress for all of us. Toda, Chag Sameach, and Shalom.